Thank you very much for joining us this afternoon at the Western Library. My name is Christine Barrow-Hone. I work in the Old Members Office at the Queen's College, and it's a great pleasure to be here and spend a couple of hours thinking about a very fascinating writer, Franz Kafka, and fantastic to have so many Queen's experts and a St. John's expert gathered here to enlighten us a little bit more about a writer that you may know very well already, or you may be intrigued by, or you don't know anything about, and you will after that hopefully be a fan. I would like to introduce you to our chair this afternoon, which is Charlie Louth, Professor Charlie Louth. He is the fellow in German at the Queen's College. He joined Queen's in 2000 and is teaches German literature from the 18th century onwards, focuses especially on poetry, but obviously also many other things. Thank you so much for being with us this afternoon, Charlie, and for bringing all this together. Thank you.
I really haven't done at all. But what I'm here to do principally is to introduce my fellow panellists, if that's the right word. So first of all, on my left, we have Karen Leeder, who's the current Schwarz-Taylor Chair in German, so based at Queen's. Before that, she was at New College, as some of you will know, I'm sure. And she's not really a Kafka expert, are you, Karen? But you do. I'm sure you know lots about Kafka. But you're known above all as for your work on modern poetry, modern German poetry, both work on it and also translating it into English, and also facilitating connections, sort of in contemporary poetry. So it's great to have you here. And then next along the line is Barry Murnane, who's the fellow in German at St. John's. And there's a funny kind of St. John's Queen symbiosis, because Ritchie was, before that, the fellow in German at St. John's and moved to Queen's to become the professor in German. And before that, Jim Reed did the same thing. So this is soon will be next, but soon will be the other way around. Anyway, let's not over-predict things. But so Barry is one of the people who was involved in arranging the exhibition that you're going to see shortly, which we were just talking about among ourselves. It's a really great exhibition. And he did his PhD on Kafka, and he also works on lots of different things, particularly the 18th century, but with a focus on the Gothic novel, I guess it would be fair to say. There you do have, and there's also one of the directors of the Oxford Kafka Research Centre. So here we have some proper Kafka expertise. And as we move along the line to Ritchie, then we really hit the kind of high point of the Kafka expertise, at least in my view, because I am still under the influence of his first book, I think your first book, Ritchie, which came out in 1985, maybe, which is I'm sure I'm out of date, but to my mind, this is the best book on Kafka. And Ritchie's also written other books on Kafka and also on a great many things. But you're in very good hands with all three of these people for a discussion of Kafka today, which we're about to kind of launch into then. And, we're here obviously because it's 100 years since Kafka died. So we're here now for that reason. And we're here because very many of Kafka's most important manuscripts are in Oxford, which we'll hear a bit more about later on, I think. But for the moment, why should we celebrate Kafka apart from those kind of particular prompts as to the now and the here? But what is there about Kafka that makes us still want to be interested in him and have an exhibition on him and read him today? Could we start there, maybe? I don't know with whom. That's up to you.
Sure. Well, I'll just pitch in.
Yeah.
I guess one of the things that's become clear, this year particularly, thinking about Kafka in lots of different contexts, is how he creates very concrete images that are also very open. And so that over the decades, over the 100 years since he's been, since his works were written, people keep coming to them anew and keep recognizing something in them. I won't say identifying with them necessarily, but recognizing something in them and getting something out of them. And so that you have waves, generations of people that keep returning to him and interpreting him in very different ways. I'm sure we'll come back to that. And it's quite remarkable for a writer to do that and to feel as kind of fresh and immediate now, in a way, as he did when he was writing. That would be my first pitch for Kafka.
Yeah, I think kind of following on immediately from that, I suppose there's very few authors get their own adjective in the same way as somebody like Kafka gets their own adjective. Now, we could kind of figure out what Kafkaesque means or doesn't mean or actually hasn't got the potential to mean, but everybody has at least heard of that adjective and can associate something with it. And there has to be a reason for that, I think. There's something about the way that Kafka represents the world he lived through around the start of the 20th century that continues to resonate in some way that helps people to follow on from what Karen said, helps people to think about the way that we're living through the world now, whether that's thinking through kind of complex things like cringe, where we see all of a sudden kind of Kafka memes popping up on social media, but it's something you can be constantly reinvented, I think, and not just by writers, not just by authors or artists, but also by them, and very important in keeping them alive, as it were, but also by young girls in South Korea for whom Kafka becomes an ideal lover, for example, completely mistakenly, it has to be said, but that these are important ways, I think, in which Kafka remains important, and that's why I think it's worth celebrating him, is to get to the bottom of that.
That's clearly true. And I think I would add that although one talks readily about interpreting Kafka, in fact, Kafka's texts can't be interpreted in the sense that you can't produce a meaning and say that's what the text is about. The texts have meanings, a great many, but no one meaning. You can say, for example, that Hamlet is about revenge and hesitation, Macbeth is about ambition, but Kafka's works can't be pinned down and classified in that way. That makes them, especially the shorter works, enormously rewarding to teach, because the more you pore over them, the more indications and suggestions you find, but it never crystallizes into a solid interpretation which you can put a label on and then walk away. The texts stay alive, despite the efforts of commentators.
Yeah, that's very true, the teaching point. I think that's that's very nice as a teacher, because you're not really in a position of authority as a teacher when talking about Kafka, I don't think. I mean, clearly there are things you can know and that others don't know, but in fact, someone else's interpretation is as good as yours, really, by and large. One thing I'd like to just sort of make clear, it's probably clear to everyone here, but it's not always clear when you do talk about Kafka with people who don't necessarily, may have read him, but don't realise that he's actually a German writer. I often find that people are surprised that he wrote in German. So maybe we could say a little bit about that, and then that would lead on quite nicely to the question of how his manuscripts ended up here, perhaps.
The distinction is important. He's a writer who wrote in German rather than a German writer.
Yes.
And that's not just to be kind of pedantic, but that idea, of course, so the Austro-Hungarian Empire, but growing up in Prague, he's somebody who grows up between languages. So there is also a choice to write in German for him. He can speak and does also write in Czech. And then later in life learns Hebrew, or starts to learn Hebrew at least. So there are multiple languages that are important for Kafka, and I think that's where I want to go with that point, essentially, is the multiple languages that are important to Kafka make him attractive to us as well. This idea of somebody growing up in a translingual location, somebody growing up in a multicultural location, that all feeds into his texts, I think. And makes the text really, really, really rewarding, of course. That's just as a first idea, maybe, to start with.
Yeah, but I want to qualify that a little. Kafka's not a bilingual writer like Joseph Conrad, who had Polish and French at his disposal as well as English. Kafka did know Czech very well, but not perfectly. With his business correspondence, for example, he got his brother-in-law, a native speaker of Czech, to correct it. Mind you, Kafka was a perfectionist by nature, so I imagine his business letters were very good. Writing in German, he had at his back the tradition of German literature, especially Goethe, and among his literary models are German writers of short fiction, like Kleist. He was a great admirer of Kleist's Novellen. Writers of short prose in his own day, like Peter Altenberg. It's interesting that Kafka had very strong literary tastes. There are some writers he admired to the point of idolatry, others he had the good word to say for, and also how one-sided in some ways. He seldom read poetry. His favourite poem was one by the Romantic writer Justinus Kerner called Der Wanderer in der Sägemühle, The Wanderer in the Sawmill, in which the wanderer imagines a log as a saw cuts into it, speaking and protesting. Now, you can make obvious connections with the tendency to masochism, which is very apparent in Kafka's Diaries. But my point is simply that Goethe and German short prose are, I think, more than anything else, the creative matrix of Kafka's own writing.
And he was influenced by Yiddish as well, wasn't he? Or at least Yiddish theatre at some point later on. Is that not right?
Yes, in fact, one of his few public appearances was when he gave a speech to a Prague audience on the Yiddish language. Yiddish at that time wasn't yet recognized as a language in its own right. It wasn't called Yiddish, it was called jargon, and it was thought to be not a proper language, but a set of scraps stolen from European languages. Theodor Herzl, the founder of Zionism, was quite clear that if a Jewish state were established, inhabitants would not speak Yiddish, because it wasn't a proper language. He thought that all European languages would be spoken there, but German would predominate. Well, things haven't worked out that way. As for Yiddish, Kafka understood Yiddish. It's actually not that difficult to understand because 90% of the vocabulary is German. And he went very enthusiastically to the Yiddish theatre, which performed in a cafe in Prague in 1911, 1912. He made a great friend in one of the actors, Isaac Louth, who kept in touch with him, was pathetically grateful to him, and who died many years later in the Warsaw Ghetto. And for each you talk about Kafka, the many roads lead to the Holocaust, in which his three sisters all perished. But we may go there later. Let's not go there now. Kafka was also, well, he had a classical education. He and his friend Max Brod used to read Plato after they had graduated in order to keep up their Greek. He was pretty good at French. He was a very, very cultivated man, except that by his own account, he had no ear for music. And he says somewhere in a letter, I'm not only unmusical, I'm unmusical to a degree not matched by anybody else that I know. But Kafka was a man fully immersed in European culture.
Maybe just to pick up on that point, it's also, in a sense, not just that he was interested or was acquainted with Yiddish culture, it's also the productive reception of Yiddish culture. So, and particularly around the Yiddish theatre, that there's a real prominence around gesture and bodies and movement of bodies in Kafka's texts. And an eye for details of bodies, whether they're grotesque bodies or whether they're normal bodies moving through space. That's one of the remarkable things around his text. And that's something which he could have had without Yiddish theatre, but is certainly spurred into action through Yiddish theatre. And I think that's typical of Kafka's relationship to most of the literature that he likes, in a sense. He doesn't just read it, he makes use of it and makes his own thing out of it.
Yeah.
Very important to read aloud.
Yeah.
And to feel the rhythm of sentences. To act them out with the body.
Well, that leads on nicely to thinking about how he has also been inspiration to other kind of artists and writers, which also comes into the exhibition to some extent, doesn't it? Was that you, Karen? Were you going to talk about that?
I think Barry and I were going to talk about that.
I don't know who wants to. Yeah.
I mean, so perhaps I'll just fill in the reason I'm here, although I'm not a Kafka scholar, is that Oxford decided to do something called Oxford Reads Kafka, alongside the academic and the funded academic project, which Barry will talk about and which is part of Oxford Kafka's Transformative Communities. We decided to do something larger, to reach outside the university as well, called Oxford Reads Kafka. And there were a number of things that we did from all the divisions. And I represented the humanities division, and there was somebody from each division. And we created a programme of events to celebrate Kafka. And it was very important, I think, we can come back to some of those things, but it was very important that there were also creative aspects to that. And in the humanities, we did a couple of things that were creative, and we'll see if the pictures work. So one of the things we did, so we took metamorphosis as the theme in the humanities broadly, because that was the book that we gave to all the students, a copy of Metamorphosis, and also to libraries and schools and reading groups and some alumni groups. And so we moved from that and looked at various sort of forms of metamorphosis in Kafka. And one of those was a rather amazing one-man show called Kafka's Ape, based on a story, a report for the Academy that Kafka wrote, in which an ape apes being human in order to escape being captured. And this was done by a South African writer and actor and artist called Tony Mayambo, as a one-man show, which we held here in Oxford. It's gone on to win lots of awards in Edinburgh, so I feel really proud that we got it here first. And it's been turned into a book and published in English as well. And it is marked by the experience. It's been touring for 10 years, and it's marked by the experience of that 10 years. And so it's a one-man show that tells the story. It's incredibly intense, but also brings with it Black Lives Matter, brings with it the wildfires in Australia when it was touring there, brings with it COVID even, and sort of demonstrates that way that multiple scenarios and contexts can resonate in Kafka. So there are a couple of pictures here. It's a very striking show. And then we put it together. That's an advert, really. And let's go and see it. And it's incredibly intense emotionally, but gesturally also. It's a very powerful piece, and shows how Kafka, a short story, can translate into drama. And we put it on at the old fire station, along with a stand-up show, stand-up and music show, Words and Music by Ed Gochen, which was also based on the same story. And it's a kind of, not a shaggy dog story, but a shaggy monkey story, as it were. And again, so showing how Kafka can come from the page and reach very different audiences and transform into, metamorphosize into different genre that all deal with this kind of borderline of animal and human, and ask what it is to be human. So those are the two big creative things we did out of the Oxford Reads Kafka humanities side. But I can talk about other things. But I know that it links in a way directly, doesn't it, to you, Barry?
Yeah, absolutely. Because I think one of Karen mentioned it just there. It was kind of one of the big events around this Oxford Reads Kafka was a day of reading the Metamorphosis. Every student in the university was gifted a copy of the Joyce Crick translation from OUP. We came together, for example, for a public reading in the Sheldonian around it, and the idea was that precisely that moment, the transformative experience which everybody seems to have when they read Kafka. And that's also an idea that's at the heart of the research project that Karen just mentioned, Kafka's Transformative Communities. We got funding for a 3-year AHRC project using that title. And the idea behind it was that Kafka's works are in themselves kind of, I suppose they're, in a sense, they're perfect in their own form, and we could just read them in their own form like that. But actually, the experience of reading Kafka and creative responses to Kafka throughout decades since, in the 100 years since his death, have been responsible for being able to turn him into precisely that writer who gets his own adjective. They're not just in a museum. These are works that are constantly reinvented by the artists that engage with his works. And we're interested with our project. This is the website for our project, Kafka's Transformers. The idea behind this being that the reading of Kafka in different geographical locations is also important for community building structures. So he can be used in precisely the types of ways that Karen has described for Kafka's Ape, whether that's in post-apartheid South Africa, or whether it's in Australia, or whether it's then in Oxford or Edinburgh, where a play like Kafka's Ape gets a completely different logic or a completely different kind of political valence. And as part of this project, yes, there's an academic side where we'll all be writing books. But one of the things that I think was particularly innovative about this project, and I think this is one of the reasons probably why we got funding for it, was because we were also interested in engaging with artists to produce a body of work which would in itself be a form of innovation arising from our project. So we're not just producing scholarly work, we're also producing new artistic work. And we worked with a team of artists, some of whom were involved in the exhibition, which we'll go and see, and we can say a little bit more about that, and you'll find out more about that when we go through the exhibition. But we also worked with a team of designers and a theatre and performance group called Trigger, and the designer was Carl Robertson. Carl Robertson is a designer who's worked with Björk, he's worked with Coldplay for stage designs, concert designs, and the likes of that, to create this amazing performance space of a man beetle with a stage inside, in which we invited the local community from Oxford to come, engage in round tables, listen to performances to experience performances by world-leading artists. And also, for example, one event which was particularly, I think, kind of very interesting was a group of Parkinson's patients from the Oxford area who created their own adaptation of the Metamorphosis as a form of therapy in this space. We also worked with Arthur Pita and Ed Watson. Ed Watson, the previously male dancer of the Royal Ballet. Arthur Pita responsible for the Metamorphosis in 2011, 2013, prize-winning performance back then, to create a new adaptation of The Hunger Artist, which premiered on the centenary of Kafka's death on the 3rd of June. I'll show you an excerpt of that. We also worked with Abacus Publishers to produce this collection of short stories, A Cage Went in Search of a Bird, which you may have seen. It was reviewed in The Guardian, The Observer, The Daily Mail, all the newspapers picked up on this. And one of the most interesting things about this collaboration was, and it speaks to what Karen was saying and what we said before, was most of the writers who we asked to take part in this only needed to be asked once. Kafka is one of those writers that other writers nowadays, leading writers like Ali Smith, for example, are just motivated to write on. It was completely exciting for them. Another artist who we worked with was Ed Harris. Maybe you came across the BBC Radio 4 series Orwell versus Kafka. We worked with Ed Harris. He was a writer in residence, still is a writer in residence with us here at the Kafka Transformative Community, to produce the 3 radio plays that emerged from that. So The Man Who Disappeared, an adaptation of the American novel, a version of The Trial, and then also a kind of a biopic. Actually, it can't be a biopic because it's on radio. What would you call it? What would you by oral? I don't know. Anyway, a biopic on radio based on the relationship between Franz and Felice Bauer. All available on the iPlayer. If you haven't heard them, do listen to them. And then the other artist who we worked with, and you'll see this in more detail in the exhibition, was an artist, a London-based artist called Tessa Farmer, who created for our exhibition and in partnership with us an original response to the Metamorphosis, which is in the exhibition next door, and we can talk a little bit more about that when we're there. Maybe just to finish up, I wanted to give you to let you have a quick look at a section of this of the Hunger Artist. I'm not sure how this plays. Do I need to do it on the laptop maybe? Yeah, I mean, and maybe just to finish up on that, on those transformative kind of adaptations, it's astonishing the kind of the quality of artists you can get to come and work with you. I mean, this is a dancer and a choreographer who are both in demand all over the world. And they find the time to come and live with us in Oxford for a couple of weeks to put together an original response. I mean, these are people who could be earning significantly more money in places like Copenhagen or in New York, could earn more money even just by kind of, well, Ed Watson is now kind of modeling for Bräuninger, a kind of a clothing chain company in Germany. You know, that's the level of response and love that Kafka generates amongst creative artists, and I think that is something which we can really build off in the humanities. I think if we can continue those types of arrangements.
Yeah, thanks very much. So, I mean, of course, the other thing that's been happening to do with the centenary is new translations of his works, including, I think, a whole new translation of all of Kafka's diaries. I mean, how important are his diaries to understanding his work, would you say, Ritchie? And how does the translation sort of fare as a version in English?
It's a very good translation, and it has the bonus. It has absolutely excellent notes,
Right.
more than 1,200 at the back, explaining the allusions to Kafka's reading, to places in Prague, to people he knew, information you cannot easily find elsewhere. So diaries are not conventional diaries. A diary makes one think of a set of entries for successive days. The classic example we all know about is the diary of Samuel Pepys. Thomas Mann's diaries are like that. Kafka's are not like that. They are roughly chronological, but they also contain, besides records of events in his life, personal emotional outbursts, little stories. Some of the stories afterwards published separately did appear in these diaries because these are from notebooks which he kept for various purposes. So the diaries are extremely interesting, but they are a work in their own right. They're not a key to Kafka. They're another creative work by Kafka, and as that, well worth having. And I very much recommend people to acquire this book, and it's probably best read in conjunction with a biography of Kafka. The one to be recommended now, I think, is probably the 3-volume biography, which has been translated to English by Rainer Stach, although there is a German, as yet untranslated biography, which I think is better, but Stach is informative, interesting, and a very entertaining read.
It's worth saying those diaries are Ross Benjamin, who translated them. Always name the translator.
Yes.
We'll actually have Ross Benjamin here in Oxford on the 10th or the 11th. I can't remember of October, whichever the date Friday of North Week is. I can't remember the Friday of North Week. So in about 3 weeks' time, he'll be coming, and we'll have a question and answer panel with the translator of these diaries. Because I think one of the things which Ritchie was alluding to was the fact that we've had translations of Kafka's diaries in English, but they've been incomplete. And things have been taken out of them for certain political reasons over the years. I mean, in terms of kind of Kafka's biography and what we're allowed to know, what we weren't allowed to know. And this is the first translation that gives us, I suppose, the kind of the complete diaries. In that
yes, there are two kinds of omissions in particular for the earlier versions. One is strong sexual allusions. Kafka, for example, met a rich art collector who was also a great womanizer, and who told extraordinarily raunchy stories about his exploits. Max Brod, editing the diaries, cut that out, but they're now here. Second, Kafka put in a lot of excerpts from his reading. He read books, for example, about Napoleon's campaign in Russia, and the imagery of snow, etc. Not only that, the imagery of the commander, the person trying to remain in authority, links up in several ways with the imagery of his last novel, The Castle. So the diaries are a real mine of information and suggestion.
And I mean, how easy is it to translate Kafka and maybe particularly the diaries? But I mean, what sort of problems do you think his work throws up to a translator?
Well, if I can comment, because I've done it, I translated the novel which Kafka called Der Verschollene, but which has long been known as America, the title Max Brod gave it. Quite frankly, it's the easiest thing I've ever translated. Kafka's language is very simple. He doesn't make puns. You just have to try to find an equivalent for his beautifully balanced sentences. It's not the language that is difficult with Kafka, but a great many other things.
I think Ritchie's too modest.
I think so
Kafka-
too.
It's very difficult to translate, and there are reasons for that. One of Kafka's translators, Michael Hoffman, said the language was as approachable as it is strange. And I think that's a really interesting balance. So it lures you in and looks very simple on the surface. But actually, you mentioned the word, I think, tension, or something came up when you were saying there is a kind of tension in the sentences, which is very finely balanced, and a lot of translators do it very badly. If you cleave too close and trying to get really close to the German, then it sounds really fussy and bulky in English. And if you go too far away, it becomes too slack and conversational. So it really is about a kind of balance, which is quite hard. You need to be immersed in that language, like Ritchie is, in order to be able to do that. And I think there are quite a lot of bad translations of Kafka around. So I think, it's tribute to Ritchie's knowledge that he says it's the easiest thing in the world.
Maybe just to put some context on that, one of the projects that we had involved a performance of Kafka with Kristen Scott Thomas in London. And we had quite a bit of difficulty actually picking the right translation of the text that we wanted to use, because she kept on coming back to us going, but that one by Joyce Crick is too fussy. We need to use the Hoffman one here. That one by Hoffman, that's not quite right. We need to have the Joyce Crick one here. And I think it's the pick and mix of translations. I think Ritchie really is kind of, downplaying the efforts that it took to make the Fasholina, to make your version such a convincing translation, actually.
Thank you very much.
Modest.
Yeah, and I mean, just as there's a diversity of approaches to translating Kafka, then there's also different approaches to reading him. So, I mean, where are we with that these days? I mean, what are the particular approaches which he's attracting especially? Or is it, as Ritchie said at the beginning, is he sort of, as it were, one of these sort of almost sort of neutral texts that sort of can receive any sort of approach that you'd care to lay on him?
One of the things I'd like to say there is, because I haven't talked about it yet, which is part of the Oxford Reads Kafka, was also an academic, sort of more academic, but public reaching side. And all the divisions talked about Kafka in different ways. So there was a wonderful exhibition all about insects over in the Natural History Museum, and the social sciences talked about disability particularly, and had a number of lectures and thinking about the borders of the human in terms of disability, or shape-shifting, or metamorphosis of the body. So and one of the things I did was get lots of colleagues from the humanities, but also from outside, to think about Kafka in relation to their own sort of specialisms. And I got a really interesting snapshot of what people are thinking about Kafka now. So there are 12 conversations. They're on the Oxford Reads Kafka website. So we've got a little burst of them there, actually.
Somewhere, weren't they? Yeah.
Yeah, but don't worry if we can't find it now.
This was it, wasn't it? Yeah.
Oh, thank you, Barry. Thank you. And it kind of crystallised. I think you'll just see it. There's no sound, and it's about 30 seconds. It just gave a snapshot of now what people are thinking about, and I was really struck by two things: environmentalism and the body. And of course, there were loads of other things too, but that seems to be the way of reading Kafka now. Not to say it's the only way of reading Kafka, we're back to what Ritchie was saying, but every age or every moment seems to have its particular approach.
If I can tell an anecdote, after I published a book on Kafka in Oxford's very short introduction series, I unwisely took part in one of the things that OUP arranges to promote his books. Namely, they got a number of ordinary members of the public to come and hear about half a dozen different books in the very short introduction series. And the authors all went to meet these readers in a bookshop in Leamington Spa. And in a kind of speed dating, the public were divided into groups of about 6, and we moved from one to the other. Well, I don't know how my fellow authors who had written books, if I remember, about Sikhism and Descartes got on, but I found, confronted with 6 people who had never heard of Kafka, knew nothing whatsoever about them, that all I had to do was tell the story of the metamorphosis. And they responded and said quite spontaneously, it's like a story about a disabled person. And of course, it's quite true, because the feelings that the family have about the transformed Gregor are very like the feelings one might have and be ashamed of in looking after a disabled relative, including, I'm afraid, the inadmissible feeling that you wish they would die. It's all there in the story, and it resonates with people's experience.
We just had I guess, well, our major conference, Kafka conference for the centenary year, the last 3 days here in Oxford. We had 85 delegates from around the world. So we're kind of in a position to confirm exactly what Karen was saying. I think it's, so we had people come and talk about Kafka in Kerala. We had people come and talk about Kafka translations in Urdu. We had quite a few people coming from South Korea, quite a few people from Japan, from Latin America, from Africa. And it's astonishing, actually, the kind of that ability to adapt Kafka's texts into new paradigms. I don't like the word paradigms, but I can't think of anything better right now. It's into new debates that are important to people at different points in time. And I think the three things that stuck out to me from most of the papers, I mean, Ritchie took part in it kindly as well. The three themes that stuck out to me most were using Kafka to think through questions of identity in the widest sense, whether that be disability, whether that be post-colonial identity, whether that be globalization, whether it be sexual identity. Definitely identities were something which was absolutely central. The other thing that seemed to me to be absolutely central was exactly this question of ecology. Bruno Latour published a book based around the metamorphosis, but talking about coming out of the lockdown period, after lockdown, and it was a way in which thinking about the ways in which the globalization and modernization debates and practices of the 20th century have led to the type of environmental crisis, moments of multiple environmental crises that we're living through now. And that involves kind of writing about the links between capitalism, industrialization, all sorts of different things, but coming back to this question around ecology. And that was absolutely central. And I think the other thing that came out from this was the amount of people working on adaptation in the widest sense, whether that be into graphic novels, whether that be into performance, whether that be into visual art or kind of static pieces of art rather than performance, or in traditional media like literature, as in fiction or poetry, film, etc. That they were the three kind of key themes, I think, that emerged. Well, not themes, but three areas that emerged. And one thing that's become clear to me is that there was a period between, I guess, kind of across the 1970s and 1980s, where Kafka was kind of dominated by a global north, kind of, so Northwest European and North American interest in things like post-structural theory. So we're only thinking about the text and the form of the text and the likes of that, trying to kind of separate it off from these various different kind of localizations and politicizations of Kafka. That's definitely over. Kafka in locations now, and Kafka in groups and communities, that's where the debate is at now. We're not just interested in these kind of, in that pure kind of working of a literary text anymore. And that was really exciting for me to see, because it shows that our project is also kind of at that vanguard, I suppose, of where the debate is going around the world.
And is it worth saying it sometimes sort of it takes a moment to believe it? For example, one of the writers we were talking about was Barry Murnane, who's a post-colonial French African writer, and contemporary, and the fact that she's talking about race by going through Kafka. It takes a moment to think, why is that happening? What's going on? Or Ritchie, for example, going through Kafka to talk about a kind of quite a contemporary but also essential conversation. So it's fascinating, that, I think, and very exciting.
Yeah, absolutely.
Yeah. So I mean, there's time for questions, but I think before we go to questions, we ought to hear how the manuscripts ended up in Oxford, because that's a very interesting story, and it takes us back to the text, which we should never forget, despite what people are saying. Yeah. So I think, Ritchie, you were going to kind of relate that story, if you don't mind.
Yes, I'll tell the story as quickly as I can. Kafka's manuscripts were left in the possession of his friend Max Brod, who went on living in Prague. When the Germans invaded Czechoslovakia, Brod and some friends left as quickly as they could, and Brod, besides his personal possessions, had Kafka's manuscripts in a suitcase. As the Germans entered Czechoslovakia from the west, Brod and his friends were leaving it from the east. They were the last train to get out of Czechoslovakia. They made their way across the Black Sea via Turkey to Palestine, then still a British protectorate, and Brod kept the manuscripts. Many years later, Malcolm Paisley, the great Kafka scholar, who was the tutor in German at Magdalen College, happened to hear that one of Kafka's relatives, his great-nephew, was studying law at Lincoln College. Malcolm got in touch with this student, who is now, I think, a retired lawyer. We know him. His name is Michael Steiner, and found that Brod was not the legal owner of all the manuscripts, and the bulk of them were legally in the possession of Kafka's surviving great-nieces, the daughters of two of his sisters who perished in the Holocaust. By this time, the manuscripts had been moved, most of them at least, to a bank vault in Zurich, because it was after the Suez Crisis. There were fears of an invasion of Israel, as it was by then. Paisley got permission to transport the manuscripts to a secure academic setting named the Bodleian. He got the news that the permission had come through when he was on a skiing holiday in Austria. He went to Zurich, examined the manuscripts in the bank vault, packed them into his car, insured them for £100,000, seems an amazingly small sum, and drove them, I imagine with constant anxiety.
Very slowly.
Well, crossing the channel, I imagine, he wouldn't dare to leave his car. As a result, they're now in the Bodleian. Some manuscripts remained in Brod's possession. Kafka had actually given him the manuscript of the trial, and Brod gave it as a present to his mistress. It was bought by the German Literary Archive in Marbach in 1988, I think, for an immense sum in Deutschmarks. And there's been a lot of speculation about the remaining manuscripts in the possession of the National Library of Israel. The literary remains there don't amount to much. But what they do have that is exciting is a large number of drawings by Kafka. Some of his drawings are known, but this is a trove of over 100 drawings, very remarkable, owing something to Japanese penned ink drawings, which he was keen on. They've now been published in a book in both German and English. The English version is published by Yale University Press, and it's well worth looking at. That's the story, as concisely as I can tell it.
So thank you very much to our three panellists, and thank you very much for coming.